friends, it's Michael Parker, and welcome back to another episode of Michael Parker Media. Today, we're going to have a little different flavor in the podcast, and we're going to go back to the year of 2008. At that time, I was hosting a show called Dark Matter, and the episode that you're going to hear today is compiled from several episodes that I did at that time covering the Stephenville UFO sighting of January 8th, 2008. It was a huge story at the time, and over time, it's been somewhat forgotten. As we approach more talk of UAP disclosure with the whistleblowers of this past summer and ongoing efforts to determine what the reality of the UAP UFO situation is, I thought it was time to go back and discuss this. In this particular episode of UFO history, the Stephenville sighting was, in my mind, one of the greatest UFO stories in America ever. And at the time, it garnered a great deal of press recognition and was treated somewhat fairly, which was, I think, a different flavor. And we talk about that a great deal during the show. And during the show, the first 40 minutes or so, you're going to hear me talking directly about the event as it was unfolding in the weeks after the initial event. And you will also hear parts of my interviews with best-selling author Jim Marrs and also Dr. Michael Salla. I did multiple episodes on the Stephenville UFO subject at the time, and this is cobbled together from probably 8 to 10 hours of programming. So this is live radio that you're going to be hearing that I've put back together in this 1 hour and a half or so podcast. So I hope that you enjoy it. I begin the episode by talking to my producer at the time, Jerry Belmont, just about the Stephenville UFO sighting and how it was being reported. From there, I go into about 12 minutes of discussion with Jim Marrs, which happened a couple of weeks later. And then finally, my discussion with Dr. Michael Salla.
You're now listening to Dark Matter with Michael Parker.
Greetings, truth seekers, paradigm busters, new world order, civil disobedience, freedom fighters, free thinkers, higher mammals, sentient beings, good people of all types. How's it going? This is Michael Parker coming to you as always from high above the Sunset Strip in an always undisclosed location. How you doing, man? I'll tell you what, if there were ever a Dark Matter week, it has been this past week or so. Today in the show, we're going to be talking a lot about something you've probably already seen on the news. I mean, it's all over the news, this Stephenville UFO sighting. Really, really a fascinating story. We're going to be talking a lot about it. And Jerry Belmont, producer's in the office with me today in the studio.
Hey.
And Jerry and I are going to be talking about that pretty much the rest of the show. This first segment, I've got a couple things I want to run by you guys, but this Stephenville UFO thing, let me just say this. I believe that this is a very significant event. I am not saying that it is an alien-controlled UFO. What I am saying is I do believe something has happened. I'll elaborate more during the show what I think may have happened. And of course, nobody knows what this thing was. What I will say is that something happened. Without a doubt, it now appears that there's a woman who actually has footage of this thing. I saw it today, and it's not very clear. I mean, you see a couple of lights, but we'll discuss that more as the show goes on. Next week, man, we have got a smoking show for you guys, Mr. Jim Marrs. Now, a lot of you who are listening to my show are going to know who Jim Marrs is. You may have even heard the show he did with us about a year ago about his book, The Terror Conspiracy. If you don't know who Jim Marrs is, he's a Texan journalist and author. He wrote the original book, Crossfire, which Oliver Stone's film, JFK, was based upon. And Jim, whenever he does his books, he offers an incredible amount of resources in the way of footnotes and credits. He always says where he gets his information. So, I mean, I find his books to be very well thought out, very well credited and footnoted. So he's going to be on the show next week. I'm going to be asking him also about the Stephenville event because he lives kind of in that part of Texas, which is not far from Dallas-Fort Worth. So that's going to be a really, really big show. I'm looking forward to it a lot. I'll tell you what, we have got a big daddy UFO story going on right here, right now. And man, listen, if you've been turning on the news or picked up a newspaper or been on the internet, you've probably already seen something about this. And we're going to spend the remainder of the show talking about it. I've got Jerry Belmont, one of the producers, in the studio here. Now, Jerry, have you heard anything about this yet?
Just a little bit. I haven't really looked into it a whole lot, but I've got some stuff going on here on the internet right now.
You know what's amazing about this? I want to talk about something that's fascinating to me, which is just the amount of press that this particular story has gotten. Because in the past, the mainstream press has not been favorable, I guess, or
skeptical.
Well, yeah, they've been very skeptical about UFO sightings. And when they did cover them, it was almost more a freak show. Let's laugh at the people in the trailers and ha ha ha, isn't this funny, a UFO and Santa Claus is up there too or something. Let's put it this way. The coverage for this event has been gigantic. Fox, CNN, MSNBC, NPR. I mean, everywhere you look, there is some coverage of this. On Friday, I guess it was Friday night, I was just flipping through channels, and I happened on to Larry King. Now, to be fair, Larry King has done quite a few UFO shows over the year. I think he must be a believer. I don't know,
or at least curious.
Yeah, I don't know Larry King. I know that he is interested in certain metaphysical topics, but I've got to say, to his credit, every time he has done a UFO show, he's had on some good guests, and he has been fair in his coverage of it. I'm not even a big fan of his necessarily, but this show that he had on the other night, he had some really good guests, people that had seen the event. He had on a skeptic, this guy Magaha or something, who's an ex-Air Force guy, and debunker. It was a really good show. But this is just one of, literally, I've not seen this much coverage of a UFO event. I don't know if ever. Now, here's the deal. In 2006, on November 7th, Election Day, there was the big sighting over Chicago O'Hare Airport. Now, at the time, this was seen by dozens of United Airlines employees. But the deal is, and there's pictures of that event, but really, we didn't get the story about that until a month or two later. And what was interesting about it was it happened on Election Day, and it happened over a major international airport, Chicago O'Hare, one of the busiest, if not the busiest, airport in the world. So that was big news. And at the time, that was one of the first stories that I was like, wait a minute, man, I sense a little bit of a change in the wind in how this is being covered. And what was amazing to me was watching the journalists cover this, and some of them, it seemed like they were loosening up a little bit in their skepticism towards the subject. And the person that covered that, I think it's Hilkovich, and he was actually part of the transportation coverage for a particular, maybe the Chicago Tribune, maybe I can't remember. I've got it here. I'll look it up. The point I'm trying to make is that was one of the first big UFO stories, and a big story where I saw it getting a little bit more traction in the mainstream press, and some of the people, they didn't want to say, hey, I believe that this is a UFO, but they were a little bit more open to the subject, and it got a little bit of traction. Well, that was a big deal. And over the years, various countries have been opening up their UFO files. France, a few years ago, did this thing they called the Cometa Report. And several South American companies have opened up their files. The Ministry of Defense in England has opened up some of their files. So we've got countries around the world over the last 5 to 10 years, gradually coming around, and there's still nobody saying, hey, UFOs are here necessarily. But then just recently, a month or two ago, and I mentioned this on the show a week or two ago, that there was this one person from the Japanese government, and Michimura or something was his name, and he basically had been forced by journalists to say something about UFOs. And his response at the time was somewhat non-committal, but he did say, I do believe they exist, at the end of his statement. And some of the reporters kind of laughed. Well, my biggest curiosity about this whole thing, besides the fact of just what was this that was seen in Stephenville, is what is going on in the back rooms of media, major media, newsrooms, and news companies right now. Now, the most incredible thing that I saw, and this was on rawstory.com, I think is the name of the website. I saw a YouTube link to a story that Fox News did about it. And I guess Fox in the mornings kind of has a young kind of hipster show where there's a young, very attractive blonde woman and a young, attractive guy, and they play off each other. And I think this is kind of Fox's attempt at
Regis and Kathy Lee.
You know what? That's an excellent way to put it. And even for a younger demographic, perhaps.
Right.
I don't know the name of these two people. I mentioned it to somebody else, and they knew right away who I was talking about. What was amazing about this is, and this is when I began to get really interested, because I was already interested from reading the reports, but I read so many UFO reports coming from all across the planet all the time that I always take a wait and see attitude to them. But what amazed me in this little segment that I saw in this link, the host and hostess were talking about the Stephenville sighting. And they gave it reasonably fair coverage, and they explained what had gone down, and they had said what some of the witnesses had said. They had said what the Air Force said. And towards the end of the segment, the hostess said something to the effect to the male host that the U.S. Air Force says this and this, and then the male cohort says, well, that's what they always say. And she looks at him and she goes, well, do you believe? And the guy pauses, and this is on Fox News, people. He pauses, and then with a big smile, he goes, yeah, I do. And she goes, well, you're not the only one. And then they bring up the graphics for these various polls over the years of how many people believe in UFOs or how many people have seen them, how many people believe that they might be extraterrestrial or what have you. So obviously they knew that they were going to have this conversation where this young man was going to say, yes, I believe. And then he gets back on it and starts riffing. Well, just think about how big the universe is. We would be very arrogant to think that we were the single inhabitants. Okay, well, we've all heard that argument before. But what amazed me about this is I'm like, am I really seeing this? Am I seeing two people on Fox News talk about this subject reasonably cohesively? They're having fun with it, but they're still putting some good information out. And to go a step further, one of them admits that they believe. Now, he doesn't say, I believe that this event was a UFO. She just asks him if he believes, and he says yes, which I interpret to mean, yes, he believes that UFOs could exist. This may not be one, but he believes they exist. The reason I bring this up is because I think something's going on here, which interests me almost as much as the actual sighting. The amount of mainstream media coverage, which this thing has just gotten, leads me to have a lot of ideas about what may or may not be going on here. On the upside, the good side, I am pleased to see this much reasonable coverage of one of these types of events. We don't know what this is. This may still turn out to be something explainable. But in the meantime, I'm seeing more coverage by mainstream media, big mainstream media, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, Fox News. Lots of print media is covering it. And of course, the blogosphere and the internet is always loaded with a lot of UFO stuff. But to see it on your television and see it talked about fairly and reasonably comprehensively and cohesively is makes me feel good, actually.
Well, why do you think that is, Michael? Is somebody just turning on the switch right now?
Well, you know what? I mean, that's something that, in a way, I want to kind of allude to this, but leave it for Jim Mars. But I think that there is something going on here, people, and I believe that it's very interesting. For those of us who have been in the UFO game for a long time, this is really exciting stuff. Nobody knows what this thing is yet, but just the fact that we're seeing rational conversation about it, and so many people talk about it. And I'll tell you what, by God, there is one particular witness in this Stephenville case that to me is what I would call a star witness. He's a former pilot. I've seen this guy interviewed now on television, and man, I'll tell you what, I want to get this guy on the radio because he is unflappable. This guy is about 100 light years from crazy, okay? This guy is completely reputable. He's a pilot. He flies a Cessna, but I think he's got training as a freight flyer as well. Regardless, this man is very reputable, credible, at least in my respects. Now, what he's seeing is still up to conjecture, but his take on what he saw, I believe that he is being truthful and telling us in the best ways that he can what he saw. And I guess the other thing that impresses me about this man is, look, this is a guy who does not strike me as a person who's looking for attention. He seems like a very successful person on his own. He doesn't need attention. It's probably a big pain in the butt in his life, actually, to have this extra attention. But as a pilot, he knows kind of what to look for. Now, some of the UFO skeptics out there will always say this, which I think is just lame as all get out. Well, pilots aren't trained observers. I'm sorry, I don't buy that for a second. I believe that they are trained observers. They're pilots. Even if they aren't trained, if you do it with enough regularity, you begin to understand what to look for, what is normal and what is not, which will also bring us to the Air Force's explanation of this situation in a minute. But what I'm getting at on the Stephenville case, I think something's going on, and I'm incredibly excited about the amount of coverage that this thing is getting, because very little of it has been just ha ha ha, look at the little green men story. A lot of it, at the end of the segments, the journalist or whomever is covering it doesn't tip their hat to say whether they believe or not, with the exception of this young man on Fox. But they're not being outwardly skeptical. They are not making fun of the people. They are simply telling the story and saying what the witnesses saw and saying what the Air Force says and showing the information, and a lot of information. This leads me to believe that the floodgates are being opened for more discussion of this topic.
Well, okay, so when the actual sighting, the actual event took place...
January 8th.
Okay, and that was like at what time?
Yeah, I believe it was 9 p.m. Well, actually, I think this one woman who got the footage of the craft, and this woman who's got this footage, which you can probably find it on Google, she got her footage at 9:03. So I think the actual event near Stephenville was a little bit earlier than that, maybe around 8 o'clock or something. I'll look it up in my notes and see if I can get you an exact time. But it was the evening of January 8th, which was a Tuesday night. Now, for those of you who don't know about Stephenville, Texas, Stephenville is a small town, about 15,000 people. It's about 80 miles southwest of Fort Worth. I've spent time there. There's a university there called Tarleton State University. And being the band nerd that I am, when I was in 6th grade, I attended band camp there. And I can tell you, this is a very conservative Texas town, based primarily, it's an agriculture-based
A typical
economy.
Bible Belt place, right?
And you know what? I'm glad you said Bible Belt, because that actually figures into the story as well. Yes, this is a place... And I lived a large part of my life in Texas, about 2 hours away from this town. And let me just say this. For those of you who live in the country, you'll know what I'm talking about. But for those of you who live in large metropolitan cities like I do currently, you can't see that much of the sky. You can usually see up above your backyard, but then there's trees or buildings or lights or whatever that will obscure your view of a really large horizon, right? Well, in a place like Stephenville, it's a gigantic, clear sky. You can see for miles, literally, just like the old Who song. I mean, you can see in every direction, just an incredible sky. And that's one of the things that inspired me when I was a kid. I would just be in the backyard of the farm that we grew up on, and I would lay down on the ground and just look at the stars, sometimes for hours. So this is a place where something like this would have stuck out big time. It's also, I've heard some critics say, well, it is in the flight path to DFW. DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, huge airport, flown into it many, many times. But my argument to that is, well, if you're in the flight path of an international airport like that, you're pretty used to seeing planes, right? Well, we could go outside right now and look at the planes flying into LAX or Burbank or Ontario. And, these are planes that you've seen before. You know what they sound like. You know what they look like. Nothing new. At night, even, you can tell when you're looking at an airplane. You'll see, the blinking lights. And we all know because we've all seen it hundreds and hundreds of times. So this little bitty town that's now had this event, and dozens of people saw this thing, and we're going to talk about all of them during the course of the show. These are reputable people who've given pretty good descriptions of what they saw. Now we have footage that this woman took of this craft, and she wants to be anonymous, but I have seen the footage, which appeared, everybody said this thing kind of flew off, headed northeast from Stephenville. It came in towards Stephenville, and everybody says the same things. Intense lights, red, yellow, white lights, right? Most people say there was 2 lights, but then they'll say there was also kind of rapidly blinking lights, and the dimensions of this thing are just humongous, like 1 mile long by half mile wide. That's gigantic. And they also say that the thing was headed towards Stephenville, coming at an incredible speed, gradually slowing down. When it got to the city of Stephenville, it seems to just hover there for a few minutes and then keeps going northeast. Well, then we have the footage that this woman now has, and she wants to remain anonymous, but it has been shown on television. And this was close to the Webster Parish County line, which is, I guess, Arkansas. And so something definitely happened. We don't know what this is, but something definitely flew over this area of Texas.
Michael, we have an email question from Billy in Colorado Springs.
Okay.
And he asks, if the military, if it's some kind of military craft, and obviously the military is not going to say anything about it, and they're going to want to keep it hush-hush.
Yep.
So, he's wondering, how would we find out? I mean, there's no way we can twist the
Well, the
Air Force's arm or the military.
You're exactly right, and I think that's one of the core issues of this story, because in Abilene, Texas, which is very close to where I grew up, there is the Dyess Air Force Base. This is a base that has been there for years and years and years. In Fort Worth, there is an Air Force Base, and then there's another Air Force Base in Wichita Falls. Interestingly enough, the trajectory of this UFO is not really out of whack with those 3 installations. Yeah. So he points out an excellent question. Could this be some kind of military craft? I think there's certainly...
Or some kind of military experiment or
testing.
I
certainly think that's possible. Now, what's interesting, and we'll talk some more about this, is several of these witnesses, Jerry, and you may not have known about this, but this is a mind blower. Several of these witnesses have all reported seeing, guess what? 2 military fighters in pursuit of this thing, and they could not keep up. The thing was just mind-bogglingly fast,
right?
Huge, silent, incredibly bright, and several people have said that they saw fighter jets following this thing. So the Air Force is saying that we didn't have any aircraft in the air at that time over that part of Texas. I don't know if that's true or not, but more than just a few people said that they saw jet fighters in pursuit of this thing. Now, it's not unheard of for UFOs to be chased by military aircraft. We've been doing it for decades. We've tried to shoot at these things very often to our own detriment and have lost pilots over this. So, but getting back to Billy, was his name?
Yeah, Billy.
Billy's question, and thank you, Billy, for that email. The question is here, could it be a military craft? Absolutely sure could. Here's what I'm positive of. I'm positive that something happened. I'm positive that something flew. Now, what it is, there's just no way of knowing yet. But what I don't think this was a hoax. I don't think these people hallucinated this. I don't think these people saw sun rays bouncing off the bellies of 2 jets like this guy from the 301 1st Fighter Wing at Joint Reserve Naval Air Station in Fort Worth said. I'm sorry. That brings me back to that other point. It's like, look, these people see planes flying into DFW all the time. This is the flight path that these planes are coming in on. So I just cannot believe that one day, even with maybe some squirrely atmospheric conditions, that 2 passenger jets or commercial airliners were in just the right angle to be hit by the sun to create this illusion of these 2 giant spheres of light. And the other thing that's really weak about that is they've used this excuse before. I mean, I don't remember which UFO case it was, but one time they said, well, that's actually the moonlight reflecting off the bellies of these ducks after they went over this lake or what. I mean, just nonsense,
Well, at that time of the night,
and
isn't it too dark, though?
This would have been early evening, and we'll pull up some more notes as the show goes on. This first segment, I'm just kind of riffing on this so you guys get the picture of what's up. I just find it really, really hard to believe that this could have been an illusion caused by the setting sun on commercial airlines. But, the witnesses aren't buying it either. They're saying that's nonsense. So,
But it is dark at what, 6, 7 o'clock?
yeah, in that part of Texas,
right?
And I guess what they're saying is that even if it's getting dark, that depending on where you're at, there's some sun that could still be reaching across the surface in the air to hit some of these planes. I don't know. I find that incredibly far-fetched. I know that we're coming up here on a break in just a second. We're going to be talking about all the witnesses here. I'm going to tell you about my opinions of these various witnesses. We're going to be talking about what I think may be going on, and this is complex. And like I say, this is something we're going to talk with Jim Mars about next week too, because my opinion of what may have happened here is even farther out than a UFO with aliens on it. Can you believe that? My explanation may be even weirder than that. Hey, you guys, you are listening to Dark Matter. So we're going to take a quick break, you guys. My name is Michael Parker. This is Dark Matter. We be talking about UFOs in the heart of Texas. We'll be right back.
This is not a test. Dark Matter with Michael Parker. We'll be right back.
This is Lon Friend, author of Life on Planet Rock, and you're listening to Dark Matter with the one and only conscious rebel, Michael Parker.
That was the always wonderful, always fabulous, always cosmic guru, Lon Friend, my friend, Mr. Lon Friend, who knows that we are not alone. And because we're still going to be talking about UFOs next week. So Jerry and I are looking at some pictures here. Well, if you go to Google Video, people, if there's anybody out here who's listening to the show right now and they're not hip to what we're talking about, for one thing, just go to Google Video and type in Stephenville UFO. And you're going to find link after link after link after link after link of all these things that have been on CNN and MSNBC and Fox and all these various news sources that their coverage is somebody who's downloaded it and put it on Google Video. I'm sure the same is the case with YouTube. We're trying to figure out if we can play some of this for you guys right now. We're not sure if we're going to be able to. But what I wanted to say is there are really good witnesses to this situation. We got dozens of people who saw this thing in Stephenville, some of them extremely credible in my humble opinion. We've got a county constable, that's Erath or Erath, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Stephenville is in the county of Erath, Erath, and I apologize, you guys, if I'm mispronouncing your county name, but one of the local constables there saw it. We've got a pilot who saw it. We've got dozens of business owners who saw it. This is not the realm of crazy, wacky people saying, oh, I saw a UFO and green men got out. These are just normal people like you or I who happen to see this thing, and God bless them, they have reported it so the rest of us can hear about it. To come forward with something like this is not really, it's not going to help you get a job. It's not going to help you make friends and influence anybody. A lot of times, so-and-so saw the UFO back in 1988 and he's never been the same since. It's not something that anybody wants to go out on a limb on. However, I want to commend the people of Stephenville, Texas, those who have reported this. Hey, you know what? Thank you. Thank you for what you've done. I believe that you saw something. I don't know what you saw. We're going to talk about that. But I thank you for bringing it forward to the people so that we could all kind of share in this and wonder what has just happened. Now, people, this thing is big. Several of the witnesses described an object that had red, orange, or yellow lights on it, depending on who you spoke to. So we can all kind of assume, okay, from red to yellow, orange is in the middle. Okay, so that's fairly consistent. These lights were so bright that some folks said that it was not really that pleasant to look at it. Several people, including a county constable, said that the lights were kind of dancing around, acting erratically, but they seemed to be in tandem in a sense that either they were attached to each other in a way that could not be discerned, or they were flying in formation. Stephenville is in the flight path of DFW, but I don't think that these people saw reflections of the sun coming off of two commercial airliners, and all of a sudden they mistake that and they think that it's a giant UFO. I think that's nonsense.
And who is the pilot that you were talking about? Is it the helicopter guy?
Now, I'm glad you brought that up. Now, about 40 people reported to the Empire Tribune, which is the Stephenville newspaper, that they saw this thing. Of all of them, the witness that I like the best, I find his testimony extremely compelling. I believe his name was Steve Allen, and he is a pilot. And this is a man who I watched the guy get interviewed. And crazy is about the last thing I would ever accuse this guy of being. He was extremely well-spoken. His descriptions of what he saw, they didn't have any sensationalized type of element. It sounded like the man was used to aerial phenomena because he is a pilot. He's used to looking at the horizon, judging distance. If he's a pilot, he's also aware of the configuration of aircraft. So the testimony that he gave, apparently he was with a couple of friends. They were up on top of the hill near Stephenville. They were clearing brush, much like our president does when he's actually doing something, clearing brush. But they were clearing brush when they saw these lights rushing towards them on the way to Stephenville. And he said, holy cow, look at that. And as it came closer to them, they noticed that it was slowing down. It was at this point that he noticed that it was continuing on to Stephenville. When it got to Stephenville, it hovered. But he said that he estimated this thing was going 2,000 to 3,000 miles per hour.
Wow, that's like
Kind of fast.
faster than the speed of sound.
It's pretty fast. Now, you might say, well, how could he estimate speeds of that nature? Well, I don't know, but I'm going to take the man's word at it. He is a pilot. I'm not. He said as best he could estimate, it's going 2,000 to 3,000 miles per hour. When it gets to Stephenville, and it had been slowing as it got to Stephenville, when it got to Stephenville, it hovers for, 5 or 10 minutes and then moves on, heading northeast. He says that what he saw, he believes to have been 1 mile long and probably a half mile wide. He said, I thought this was funny. He said it's bigger than Walmart.
Wow, something that big, traveling that fast, if we had that technology, that would be... I don't think you could hold that back.
Well, that's a very interesting point. Jim Mars is going to have some things to say to that. And like I say, that's going to be something that we're going to talk about in the next show. Right now, I just want to talk about what people saw and how they're dealing with this. This man, Steve Allen, that I think is the primo witness of this whole thing. He's a pilot, and he's a freight company owner, and he said it's absolutely, he said, quote, it was positively, absolutely nothing from these parts. Now, this is a man who is familiar with aircraft, and when I saw him on Larry King the other night, I was like, this guy's $1 million witness. This guy is the real deal. He is extremely intelligent, very well-spoken. And I'll be honest, man, the guy looks like he'd kind of kick your butt, too. He's kind of this serious, very intense guy who doesn't look like he's a daydreamer very much.
Was he ex-military?
I don't know if he's ex-military or not, but the fact that he's a pilot I found really compelling. Also, like I said, one of the county constables of the area, this guy Leroy Gatan, I think is how to pronounce it, said that he first saw glowing red lights and then white flashing lights moving fast, that even with binoculars he could not see the object to which the lights were attached. He said, quote, I didn't see a flying saucer, and I don't know what it was, but it wasn't an airplane, and I've never seen anything like it, Gatan said. I think it must be some kind of military craft. At least I hope it was. Well, yeah. And it's interesting because this guy, Steve Allen, also said that one of the reasons that people are kind of worked up in this area is that they think it might be the biblical end of time. So everybody's really freaked out. But you were talking about this medical helicopter pilot. Now, I was not familiar with this guy. So let's talk about this because you just happened upon this just within the last few minutes. And he's got some comments about this UFO.
Right, Michael. His name is Chuck Mueller, and he says he can explain what the sighting was all about. He's
Always be careful when they say they can explain it. Okay, go ahead.
He seems... Well, he's a medical helicopter pilot in Fort Worth, and he was flying south just after sunset on that Thursday.
On Thursday?
Wait a minute.
Because this happened on a Tuesday.
He said he saw unusual lights on the horizon near Granbury.
Yeah, that's in the DFW area.
Okay. Quote, he says, we were maybe 5 minutes into the flight when he saw the lights come on, one little orange light and then another one and another one in sequence across the sky. It's similar to what the constable had to offer.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 nights earlier. Okay, so this was Yeah, this was on a separate night.
So he's saying on 2 nights later, he was flying when he saw something. What is he saying that he saw? Were they flares or something like that? Or what's he explaining it with?
Well, he says he's never seen anything like it before. And he looked at the medic, and they both looked at each other, and they were like, what was that? He was a former Army pilot in Iraq, and he said he's seen airplanes dropping flares as he was flying along. It all makes sense. The color was right.
Let me just interject this. Now, anytime you hear former military people saying they got to explain something and they bring up flares, in my opinion, that's code for we're lying out our teeth here. I don't know if this man's lying. I don't know if he believes what he's saying, but I will tell you this, that this whole flare thing, they've trotted this out before. The 1997 Phoenix Lights case, 10,000 some odd people saw this thing, and a large V-shaped craft fly over the city of Phoenix, Arizona. Okay? Even Fife Symington, who was the governor of that state, has now said, guess what? I saw the thing. It's a freaking UFO. It's not from here. You know, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. I'm sorry I lied when I was in there, but hey, I was a governor of a state and I didn't want to create chaos. I understand it, you know. But here's the deal. On the night that happened, there was 2 sets of events. There was a first craft that was seen at approximately 8:30 in the evening that flew over Phoenix. And then about 2 hours later, there was this second sighting, and this is the one where this guy on Larry King the other night was saying, well, you know, clearly these were flares that were dropped out of a Maryland-based yet visiting squadron of aircraft or doing, you know, just ridiculous. Here's the deal. This flare thing, there may have been flares that were dropped that night, the second time around, but the reason, and I'd put money on this. The reason they dropped the flares is because a real UFO had just flown over 2 hours earlier, and you've got to do something in order to discredit the story. So the flares were an afterthought that it doesn't even matter who dropped them. If it was Luke Air Force Base or it was this group of visiting air squad that this Bagaha character was talking about, Larry King the other night. You know, I don't doubt that there were some flares in there, but the flares are disinformation. That is to delegitimize the original story. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, they're like trying to cover it up.
Yeah, so they can say, well, that first thing, that was just, you know, that was some fighter jets, and the second thing was some flares. Listen, so let's put it this way. I don't believe the man has got this thing figured out. I don't believe there are flares. Let's talk about what a couple of these people said. This Erath County constable, this guy Leroy Gatton, said that he first saw red glowing lights and then white flashing lights moving fast, but even with binoculars, he could not see the object to see which the lights were attached. He said, I didn't see a flying saucer, and I don't know what it was, but it wasn't an airplane. I've never seen anything like it. That's a county constable. This woman, Angela Joyner, she is the primary reporter at the Empire Tribune who has been taking all of these reports. She did not see the event. And I've seen this woman now on YouTube and on Larry King. Here again, I believe this woman. She's simply telling what the townspeople are telling her. And she's the primary reporter at the Empire Tribune. What she's saying, the common things that she keeps hearing from the dozens of reports that she's gotten, the main thing they say is red strobing lights, red or yellow or white strobing lights, no particular pattern, incredibly bright, difficult to look at, very big, incomprehensibly big, like a mile long, silent, moving at just ridiculous speed. So this woman has said, she goes, look, I've never really thought about UFOs, never really took it seriously, but she admits that she actually ended up getting spooked by this whole thing because she was taking the calls of the people who reported it, but they just kept coming in. And not only did they keep coming in, but they were consistent. Descriptions of what people saw, where it was going, fighter jets following it. She's sold on it. She believes it. She goes, look, I don't know what it is, but it's definitely made me take this subject more seriously. I mentioned earlier, here's what the Air Force said. It says, Major Carl Lewis, a spokesman for the 301st Fighter Wing at the Joint Reserve Base Naval Air Station in Fort Worth. I'm wondering if that was Carswell. Used to be Carswell Air Force Base. Anyway, he said that, quote, no F-16s or other aircraft from his base were in the area the night of January 8th when most people reported the sighting. Lewis went on to say that the object may have been an illusion caused by 2 commercial airplanes. Light from the aircraft would seem unusually bright and may appear orange from the setting sun. Major Carl Lewis, a spokesman for the 301, he said that he was certain that this was an illusion, and he was just absolutely positive that, this had to be commercial airliners. I don't believe it. I don't know what it is, but I don't think that's what it is. I'm trying to look here because there's this other person who saw it, this young man who I think actually really freaked him out. This guy, Ricky Sorrells. I'm looking for his report here. Machinist Ricky Sorrells said friends made fun of him when he told them he saw a flat metallic object. Okay, that's interesting because this guy is saying that not only he saw the lights, but he said it was flat. He said he saw a flat metallic object hovering about 300 feet over a pasture behind his Dublin home, but he decided to come forward after reading similar accounts in Stephenville Empire Tribune. He says, "You hear about big bass or big buck in the area, but this is a different deal," Sorrell said. "It feels good to hear that other people saw something because that means I'm not crazy." Amen, brother, I hear you. Sorrell said he had seen the object several times. This guy's saying he's seen this thing before. Now, I love what he's about to say here. He said he watched it through his rifle's telescopic lens and described it as very large and without seams, nuts, or bolts. I heard Peter Davenport, the head of one of the UFO agencies that takes all the reports, and here's a couple of things that he had to say about it. I found this online, and much credit to Peter Davenport and the National UFO Reporting Center. So that's where this comes from, and I want to make sure I credit him. It says, here's some of the things that he has to say regarding the reports. It says, Stephenville, Texas, Tuesday, January 8th, 2008. A very peculiar object was reported to National UFO Reporting recently, which reportedly has been seen by many people near Stephenville, Texas. We have not spoken with any of the witnesses yet, but an article from the Associated Press was released over the internet on the date of January 14th. It says, we include some raw reports which we've received to date about the alleged incident, and it goes something like this. Report 1. Flashing strobe silent, flames out of the backside and jets chasing it on 1/8/2008 at 6:15 p.m. Central Standard Time. My friends and I were watching the sunset when several strobes are flashing lights coming from the east at about 3,500 miles per hour heading west towards Stephenville, Texas. Oh, sorry. Estimated speed was about 2,000 to 3,000 miles per hour. The strobes made several changes of flash patterns and configurations. The flight duration lasted about 3 minutes. The front two strobes were about half mile across, and the back ones were about 1 mile back from the front lobes. This sounds like a flying triangle, the TR-3B, for those of you who are hip to this. The back side of the flashing lights come to a vertical flashing. Then there was two separate vertical flames about a quarter of a mile apart for several seconds, and the craft was gone. We never heard any noise from the craft. They headed west towards Abilene, Texas. Then about 10 minutes later, here came the same craft again with two jets chasing it. They were headed east towards South Fort Worth, Texas at about 4,000 feet. The jets were unable to catch and went off into the distance at full throttle. I am a pilot and have been flying for 30 years and have never seen anything like this. I also fly several times a week in the area. The craft is not from around these parts. The witnesses were, one, a male. His name has been deleted. He's a rancher and a trucker. Number two, another male person who delivers mail for the U.S. Postal Service. The third person who made a report, it says he is the owner of a large transportation trucking firm, who I think is Steve Allen, who we discussed earlier. And here's another one at the very end. It says another report. It doesn't say who this was attributed to, but it came from the National UFO Reporting Center. It says 1 mile long by half mile wide, traveling at estimated 3,000 miles per hour, being chased by military aircraft, not witnessed by me. Know that credible people were involved. Military aircraft were chasing the second appearance. A complete article is in the Stephenville Empire Tribune 110 edition. Okay, people, what we got going on here is something that it's either a real UFO. Well, it is a UFO. It's an unidentified flying object. We don't know who is on board it, who's inside it. We don't know who's driving and putting the pedal to the metal, so to speak. But what we do know is that these people saw something. I don't think it was an optical illusion. I think these people saw some form of object or objects. This could be extraterrestrial or it could be man-made. Either way, the answer should concern us. So I don't know what this is. It's worthy of us continuing to look into. And we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, and we're also going to talk a little bit about Martin Luther King before we get out of here today. My name is Michael Parker. This is Dark Matter. UFOs be flying around like footballs. We'll be right back.
This is hip-hop artist and activist Ramo Conscious. You're listening to the brilliant and multi-talented Michael Parker.
I just wanted to make a couple more comments about Stephenville before we move on to the final thing of the day. I had mentioned to you guys that there has now turned up some footage where a woman who chooses to remain anonymous has now taken footage of this thing. If you want to look for it on the internet, just go to KSLA News 12. Now, I'm assuming this is maybe in Louisiana. I'm not sure. KSLA News 12. And they show the footage that this woman took, and then a friend of hers speaks from off camera because the woman didn't want to say who she was. But what happened was the woman who shot the footage saw this thing and was just like, you've got to be kidding me. What in the heck is that? So she had the presence of mind to go get her video cameras. Now, the footage that she has shot, it was hovering near the Webster Parish, Columbia County, the Webster Parish and Columbia County state line. I guess Webster Parish is part of Arkansas, and maybe Columbia County is part of Louisiana. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at a map, but it is in the general flight plan that they said this thing was kind of going. And when I look at it, what I see, and you can't see much, but what this makes me think of is the TR-3B, which is the giant floating triangles, the black triangles, the flying triangles that you've seen in the X-Files, the ones that were flying around in Belgium in the early 90s. These are things that I believe are man-made. I'm not saying that this is what it is. I'm just saying that's what it reminded me of. We don't know what it is. But if you're curious about flying triangles, just Google it, look up TR-3B. It'll tell you what the craft are, when they were made, how they were made. And nobody has confirmed or denied that these things actually exist because nobody really can. But it's definitely what it reminds me of. So I don't know how this is going to turn out. This is all really exciting to me, and we're going to stay on it.
You're listening to Karma Air's podcast of Dark Matter with Michael Parker for the weekend of Sunday, January 28, 2008. In this episode, Michael is joined by Mr. Jim Mars, the author of Alien Agenda, Investigating the Extraterrestrial Presence Among Us. And they're also going to talk about the recent Stephenville sightings.
I've been thinking about you a lot since this Stephenville thing came on, and I know that you're not living in Fort Worth, but you're in the North Texas region still, correct?
That's right. I live in south central Wise County, which is northwest of Fort Worth and kind of due north from Stephenville. And when I heard that whatever that thing was that went over Stephenville that was last seen heading this way, I have stepped out on my porch a few times and scanned the skies, but unfortunately I don't have anything to report.
Well, let me ask you this, because I actually grew up out near Abilene, Texas. I spent some time in Stephenville when I was a kid. I actually went to band camp at Tarleton one time, and what I tried to express to my listeners in last week's show is that this area of Texas, like all of Texas, is made up of reasonable people and not given to wild and crazy stories of flying saucers and UFOs unless they are really sure they saw something. And this thing, what's really interesting to me about this, Jim, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about it, is obviously the Air Force has given us their story now, what they're saying it's about with 10 F-16s. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah, kind of like Roswell. It's kind of like changed 4 or 5 times, hasn't it?
Exactly. I mean, right off the bat, they say, well, we didn't have anything in the area. And then 2 weeks later, kind of at the last minute, they say, well, wait, hold on. We had 10 F-16s in the Brownsville Air Corridor or whatever they want to call it. And
are you aware now? And then when the reporters asked, well, who were the pilots? They said, we were not in contact with them. What?
I didn't even hear that. Well, what really made me wonder, I mean, already off the bat, I'm going to pose a lot of questions to you about this just for you and I to kind of hypothesize a little bit. But, I mean, the deal is there were several, in my opinion, very credible witnesses to this thing.
Very credible.
Steve Allen, this gentleman, is a pilot. He is a owner of a freight business. I mean, this guy would certainly know the difference between F-16s and something else.
Absolutely. And let's skip back just a little bit and recall in 1997, something huge soared low over Phoenix, Arizona. Mm-hmm. And the next day, the governor of Arizona at that time, Symington, held a news conference and said, we found the guilty party. And he dragged out it with some aide in a green alien outfit, and everybody laughed.
Right.
And they just blew it all off. And then just last year, 10 years later, Fife Symington, the governor, or the ex-governor now, goes on CNN and Larry King and says, well, I just didn't want to start a panic. He said, but I saw that thing myself, and it was huge, and it was unearthly, and it was a spaceship. So, hey, folks, let's don't wait for another 10 years. You know, when these people tell us they see something, I think they saw something.
I agree, Jim, and I'm glad you brought up Phoenix, because to me there are a few comparisons in this story with Phoenix. And in the Phoenix story, of course, you know, they said they were dropping the flares in the second sighting, the 10 o'clock post sighting or whatever. And in this one, we've got now this guy coming forward that's an Iraq vet who was in a helicopter, and he was saying that he had seen some flares, and he thought probably this is what people saw. And then, of course, the Air Force comes out, and they say, well, we've got 10 F-16s that were in the air. That's probably what you saw. Well, all of that aside, what are the things...
So eventually they'll put it together, and they'll say, well, it was 10 F-16s that were dropping military flares into a sundog.
It's a matter of time, isn't it? Unbelievable. And the deal is, I guess, Jim, the thing that fascinates me the most, and one of the reasons I wanted to ask you about this, you, better than anybody, knows that generally UFO stories, and they happen all the time. I mean, I don't want to sound jaded. I love the UFO ET enigma as much as anyone, but it takes a lot for me to sit up after a story and go, okay, let's look at this one even closer, because so many sightings occur, of which 95%, you know, we'll say can eventually be explained. However, regardless, they generally get short shrift in the media.
Right.
This story... The most amazing thing to me about this whole story is the amount of media attention that has been given to it, and some of it has been reasonably fair.
Well, not only that, but to me, Michael, the most amazing thing is not only the media attention, but the fact that the government, in the form of the military, has trotted out some of their, you know, tried and true rationalizations, military flares, sundog, 2 airliners, you know, crossing simultaneously, F-16 fighters in the area. But this time, for the first time in my memory, living memory, which is pretty long, nobody's really buying it anymore.
You know what, Jim? I've noticed that as well. I mean, because when they when they show the footage of the good people of Stephenville, they've said, well, you've heard the Air Force's response to this. What do you think? And these people are just smiling and saying, no way. I'm glad to see that, because for a long time, and I've been one of the guys who, you know, would say, well, everybody's watching too much American Idol or football or this, that, or the other thing, and they're not paying attention. Well, I get the feeling that a little bit of there's a change in the weather, and people are beginning to say, you know, we've seen enough from Vietnam through Watergate, through all of this over the years, to kind of go, I'm not so sure this time.
That's absolutely right, and I'm sure you saw the news story, I think it was just about a week ago, where the Center for Public Integrity, along with a journalism watchdog group, did a study that showed that the Bush administration had made false statements, which, you know, if you and if you and I make a false statement, we're called liars, right? But they made false statements, and they documented 935 times. So, you know, if you had a friend or an ex-friend that lied to you almost 1,000 times, they probably wouldn't be your friend anymore. You probably wouldn't have anything to do with them, would you?
You would sure write them off pretty quick, because they would be unreliable, and eventually you'd think they were going to hurt you in some way. I mean...
That's right. Well, now we're talking about the administration of the federal government of the United States, so why should we believe them on UFOs?
Well, let me ask you this. Do you feel, with this sighting, because I in an email that I sent you a couple of weeks ago, one of the most interesting things I saw, and I apologize to the audience, I don't watch Fox a lot, so I can't tell you the name of this particular morning show, but there was a young host and hostess, and they were talking about it, and they were having fun with it, of course, but mixed in with the humor, they were actually giving away some good information about the sighting. But towards the end of it, the male host was asked by the female host, she was joking, well, do you believe? And he said, yes, I do. And I found that amazing that at this point, finally, someone on the media is admitting, whether he was sincere or not, I have no way of knowing.
Right. But at least he offered a positive opinion.
Yes, and that kind of blew my mind. And since then, we're seeing, I mean, I've been looking at all the YouTube, Google videos where people have taken stuff off television, posted on there. I've watched all this stuff over and over, and I'm just very impressed with the amount of media attention this story has gotten, people's reaction, and the relative even-handedness I've seen from the media, which is not customary.
Well, let me tell you what blew me away was I saw an opinion piece in my old newspaper that I worked for, the Four-Star Telegram, which, trust me, is a gatekeeper for middle American mentality, okay?
Not the Startlegram.
Oh, absolutely. Remember their motto, yesterday's news tomorrow.
I went to school at TCU, so I'm real familiar with.
Okay, well, you're right with me then. So you know that the Star Telegram has never been a bastion of liberal, extreme, radical news. Well, they had an opinion piece talking about Stephenville, and they were pointing up the inconsistencies of the Air Force's statement and basically going, hey, what are you pulling on us here, you know? And it was really absolutely amazing. And I'll tell you, Michael, why I think, let me give you my opinion on why I think this is turning around. Excellent. The government's not being any more forthcoming than ever. Whoever's flying these things and wherever they're from, they're becoming a little bit more open in their travels. But the main thing is that it's generational. I can show you in my files, going back to the late 40s, early 50s, where the U.S. government, the authorities, the powers that be, laid on a program of denial and ridicule. There's nothing there, folks, and if you insist on saying there is, then there's probably something wrong with you. And that really was quite effective for about 50 years, okay? Because, I mean, I can't tell you how many people who, after the publication of my book, Alien Agenda, and people I'd known all my life, and they'd come up to me and say, wow, man, well, let me tell you what happened to me, or let me tell you what I saw. And I'd say, well, why didn't you tell me this before? And they said, well, I didn't want to tell anybody. I'm afraid they'd laugh at me. You know? Exactly. And so, but see, that's breaking down because we've got new generations of people coming up, and they were brought up on Star Trek and Star Wars and the idea of aliens and E.T. and extraterrestrials and other worlds out there. It's kind of a given. You know, it's like, yeah, okay, so what? And so they're a lot more receptive, and therefore they are now filling the staff positions in newspapers and radio and TV. And so when these stories come in, they don't have that old conditioning to just laugh it all off, and they're beginning to treat it like as it should be, a news story.
And also, just on a financial note, I think that this type of material is actually becoming bigger and bigger business to media outlets, because I think that a lot of people are sincerely interested in this type of information. And if a newspaper or a radio station or a television station covers this, I think that people are truly appreciative of it.
Well, Michael, you're absolutely correct, but let me tell you what's happened in the past, and I've been involved in this for years, and sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, but like, for example, some of your cable networks like Discovery, A&E, History Channel, these channels, on the one hand, they know that there is this fascination and interest out there in the public, so every now and then, every time they want ratings, then they will produce or buy a program and say, oh, UFOs or whatever, okay? But then when you watch it, they build it up, they advertise it, and then once they've got you about halfway into the program, they trot out their government-hired experts who go, yeah, but there's really nothing there, folks. And so they're trying to kind of cover both bases, you know. They want to build their audience with the public interest in UFOs, and yet they want to keep the government happy by maintaining their denial and ridicule.
Our guest today is making his second appearance. It's Dr. Michael Salla, Ph.D. Michael is the author of Exopolitics, Political Implications of the Extraterrestrial Presence. That's out on Dandelion Books. He's also the founder of Exopolitics Institute, and you can find that on the exopolitics.org website. So without further ado, welcoming Dr. Michael Salla from Kona, Hawaii. Greetings.
Aloha, Michael. Glad to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to you about the latest on exopolitics.
From what I understand, I guess there's still some occasional sightings in Stephenville after the initial rash of sightings. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. After the initial batch began in January, there were more sightings in February, and that continues up to the present day. That was something that was covered by a journalist, a local journalist at the Stephenville Empire Tribune, Angela Joyner, who was then felt compelled to resign, and then 1 week into her resignation, she was summarily terminated for continuing to cover the Stephenville sighting cases.
Dr. Salla, let me make sure I got this straight, because I did read that she had resigned, but even after she resigned, they took it. The Empire Tribune took it upon themselves to say that they had fired her?
Well, that's basically the sequence there, that on February 1st, she submitted her resignation after the newspaper had basically communicated to her to actually drop the story, stop covering it, that there were other issues that they wanted her to cover, local stories, but she continued to keep an interest, directed calls to her after-hours number, responded to emails and so forth, but the newspaper wasn't happy about her continuing interest in the Stephenville sightings cases, and so they sacked her on February 7th.
You know what's interesting about this? I mean, initially and I spoke with Jim Mars about this, I was initially very intrigued by the Stephenville story because, like yourself, I've been following the UFO enigma for going on decades now at this point. And what really interested me the most, even more so almost than the actual event itself, was the incredible outpouring of somewhat fair media coverage that it received initially.
Well, that's right. That was what was very unusual about this case. You had a local reporter, Angela Joyner, covering it, but then you had a lot of international coverage, AP, CNN, Larry King Live, a host of newspapers giving this Stephenville story a lot of coverage, and that really did bring that story to the attention of many around the world.
And it was interesting to me because in the past, obviously with the Chicago O'Hare sighting, we didn't really hear much about that until a couple of months after it happened. With Phoenix, I mean, much time passed before we got a lot of information on that. This one, pretty much straight out of the chute, it went to Fox News, CNN, all the papers and outlets that you mentioned.
Well, I think it's what we're seeing here is an important shift in attitudes in the official media. I think it was really started by Peter Jennings when he did his Seeing is Believing special back in, early 2006?
Yes.
And he was one of the first major reporters coming out saying that this was a real issue that needed to be covered. And I think just over that time we've had a succession of stories in the major media, major figures such as Larry King, covering the UFO issue, giving it a sympathetic kind of coverage. And so I think we're just having this just increase in public or mainstream media interest in the whole UFO issue.
Well, you point out a very interesting and somewhat troubling idea. In one of your recent articles, it was called Growing Media Interest in UFOs is Partial Official Disclosure of UFOs as Classified Anti-Gravity Vehicles Inevitable. And when I read that, I was disappointed at first because the idea of that, as you point out, is troubling. And another thing that I have to say about Stephenville that initially intrigued me the most at first was I was wondering, well, wait a minute, is this possibly some kind of staged event to maybe see what the response of the public would be at this point? But now, after reading your article, seeing that they've sacked this reporter who did a great job at the local paper, this Ricky Sorrells, who's one of the eyewitnesses, he's continuing to be harassed, and I want to talk about that as well, now makes me wonder and think, well, gosh, this very well, maybe this is a true extraterrestrial craft or event.
Well, it may well be a true extraterrestrial sighting. I think the size of the ship that they're seeing isn't anything that I have seen discussed in terms of covert projects.
Right.
There is a covert anti-gravity vehicle called the TR-3B, which is a black triangular vehicle, about 600 feet wingspan and so forth. And that is probably going to be what I think will at some point be announced as a covert technology that had been developed several decades ago and is what people were seeing in terms of UFOs. And I think that there will be this effort by those that are controlling the whole ET issue to initially come out with the story that all the UFO sightings are really sightings of these classified anti-gravity vehicles that have been secretly developed since the 1950s, and that's the answer to the UFO enigma. And I think that will be something that they will use for a period of time, just to, I think, condition the general public to believe that the U.S. military does have its own fleet of highly advanced anti-gravity vehicles that replicate UFO technologies, so that when the ET issue finally does break, the government can reassure the public and say, well, we have our own anti-gravity technology. That's no big deal. ETs have. We can do that ourselves.
Well, one of the for the listeners who may not be familiar with, Dr. Salla mentioned the TR-3B. What the TR-3B is, for those of you who have watched the X-Files and things of that nature, it's essentially the Flying Triangle, which is a giant craft, as Dr. Salla mentioned, 600 feet wingspan, just a gigantic craft. And obviously this thing was much larger even than that. And in Ricky Sorrells' account, he was describing something that was more akin to a rectangle and had these cone-shaped holes on the bottom of it. I mean, this is just incredibly strange.
Well, that's right. I mean, what he was seeing doesn't appear to be any kind of anti-gravity technology that I've seen described by those who've come forward to give testimony about what's happening behind the scenes. They seem to be based on the kind of Byfield-Brown principle, where you have a triangular shape gives stability when you generate large currents or large voltages between the two plates in the capacitor that's built into the vehicle, and that seems to be the optimal configuration for getting the anti-gravity effect going, which is a kind of a triangular shape. So I haven't seen anything about rectangular shapes being built to any great size that would display that Byfield-Brown effect.
Well, another thing that was interesting to me about Stephenville is Steve Allen, he described seeing these bright lights. Of course, since then, the military has said, well, it was really nothing. It was just these 10 F-16s that we had flying in that area. And obviously it wasn't that. But what else is strange is these pictures that have, and this video that has come forward, where it almost looks like a luminescent silly string being shot off into the air and making all of these strange shapes. So we've got descriptions of this rectangular shaped craft. We've got descriptions of bright lights. We've got this fast moving strange string like thing. And then, did you see the pictures that the woman near the Texas border took, where it was just a couple of lights, perhaps from the backside? Did you see that?
That one I haven't seen.
Yeah. It was just strange to me because we had several different types of descriptions of this craft. And I, over the past month, initially, I don't know, the cynical side of me thought that this must be some type of, experiment to test the waters and see how people were going to react to this. But now, after the way things have continued on, and reading people's work like yours and Linda Moulton Howe and other folks, I'm more leaning to the fact that this was, in fact, well, it's definitely a UFO and possibly extraterrestrial. It's just, it defies an explanation.
Well, I think we are probably witnessing the stage now when the number of UFO sightings continually increase to the extent where more and more people around the planet are now looking at the UFO phenomenon as something very serious and not something that can be just laughed off. And that probably does signify that the extraterrestrials that have been monitoring our planet for decades and interacting with people for decades as well, that they have reached the point where they believe that the number of sightings can increase so that disclosure may happen with them actually showing themselves unambiguously in the sky.
This eyewitness, Ricky Sorrells, he's claiming that he's being harassed, as we've heard so many times in UFO stories before, by shadowy military-type folks.
Well, that's right. Yes, he started to get phone calls by someone who identified himself at a certain point as a colonel, trying to get more information. And then there was a nighttime incident where I think it was around 2 a.m. He says he was woken up by his dogs and saw someone who had a kind of military presence near his property looking at him in a kind of menacing way. and that was part of a pattern of intimidation that he then told Angela Joyner, who was the reporter, and she wrote up a story about that.
In some ways, this has many of the hallmarks of UFO stories from the past in the fact that we've got witnesses being harassed by these shadowy paramilitary/military folks, whoever they are. We've got a reporter who did a fine job of covering this story for the local paper. Now she is without a job. And yet, initially, the media covered this with a zest and an even-handedness that I had not seen in many cases in the past. And it's truly an amazing story. It continues to unfold. And when I read your story about the anti-gravity explanation, it troubles me like it does yourself, because what you're saying is that essentially the CIA or whomever may trot out this story in the future of saying, listen, we have these craft, they're anti-gravity, we've had them for decades, that's all there is to it, that's really all you were seeing. That's problematic with me.
Well, that's right. I mean, that was something that the CIA has used in the past. I mean, they referred to the Blackbird as being a classified technology that had been developed in the 60s, and that was something that was confused for many of the UFO sightings, and that, in fact, that the CIA deliberately encouraged UFO reports as a cover for the black flights and its high performance and speed. Now, that is something that's been used in the past, and I think we'll probably have the same thing occurring with the unveiling of these anti-gravity technologies, which have been secretly developed since the 1950s. That's when the whole anti-gravity technology went black, and so since that time we've heard nothing. But these technologies have been secretly developed, and I think we are entering a phase or a period where it's likely that they are going to be unveiled as, and I think there are a number of reasons of doing it, but one, in terms of those who believe that extraterrestrials are visiting us and that the government has retrieved their technologies and reverse engineered, it will be to reassure the public that we, in fact, have this advanced technology that can match anything that possessed by otherworldly visitors.
Understood. Well, you also point out that in these recent Larry King episodes where they have covered the Stephenville sightings, that James Fox and Leslie Keane, who did that National Press Luncheon or whatever it was in November, James Fox, and I watched those, so I remember what it is that you're pointing out. He did explicitly try to avoid discussing these craft as being extraterrestrial, and instead just wanted to more make them anomalous or unknown, as in, unknown flying object. And I agree with you that in some way it seems like, and I have no axe to grind with James Fox because I do not know him, he seems like a reasonable person, but in some ways you're right in saying that he's kind of injecting himself into the dialogue as almost a gatekeeper. Well,
exactly, yes. He has basically inserted himself into the dialogue as a gatekeeper, saying, look, we're just going to discuss this as a UFO incident. We're not going to go down that track of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And he says, well, this is media savvy because look how much media we've gotten. We've got Larry King and we've got international media paying attention to this press conference on November 12. And I think there is great danger there that we may be being set up. I don't think it's an accident that you have people like the former governor of Arizona,
Fife Symington,
involved in this at a very high level. Wow. I mean, Fife Symington, whatever you have to say of him, is someone who knows how to work with the system, so I would not be surprised at all if he had not been secretly tasked to, come forward, say that, yes, indeed, he had his own sighting, and that just talk up the whole UFO phenomenon to kind of prepare the public for this level of kind of deception, if you like, that the UFO phenomenon really is these classified anti-gravity technologies that people have been seeing for decades, and that's all there is to the UFO phenomenon. There's nothing more.
Well, that's disheartening. I hadn't actually thought of that. I covered the Fife Symington comments when they happened, but you're right. I mean, he certainly could have been touched upon to do this, whether he was offered something good as a result of it or just made an offer that he could not refuse, who knows. But one thing I would say about the anti-gravity technology, and just to play devil's advocate, is if they do trot out the anti-gravity explanation, I would think that that in some respects that has some downside downside as well, in that some people would immediately stand up and say, well, wait a minute. If you do have this, then why are we still relying upon fossil fuels to the extent that we are, when in fact you have this technology? And why do we have a national space agency, NASA, that's still using these solid propellants, which is totally antiquated technology, when we could be floating around the universe or at least within our solar system on this type of technology?
Well, I'm sure that'll be one of the benefits that we gain if they come forward with this explanation that we have these advanced anti-gravity technologies, and that it does make redundant a lot of the fossil fuel energy sources that are used for the conventional aerospace industry, and of course in cars and so many other appliances and as an energy source. And I think that they will probably spin that disclosure in terms of these technologies are highly unpredictable, very powerful technologies, and it took us all this time to ensure that this technology would be developed safely without endangering others and not falling into the wrong hands, because it is such powerful technology that people could presumably develop more powerful weapons with that. So, they might use that kind of argument for why they didn't disclose earlier, but I think the consequence will be, as you were saying, that this will allow the development of energy technologies that replace the fossil fuel industry.
And what's amazing, like you pointed out, it could be a situation where they already know that that's probably going to happen, but they're really only looking for a short-term solution on the way towards... I don't know if I believe, unfortunately, that we're ever going to get full disclosure, but you point out in one of your papers that we very well could already be on a path that has been planned possibly for decades of how all of this is going to unfold, and this is just one more hoop they're going to have us jump through. And the argument that I put up just a second ago, they have already accounted for, and think, well, that's 2 or 3 or 5 years of squabbling on the road towards whatever we're going to do next.
Exactly. I think that they have thought this through very well, that they have accounted or given themselves time for a period where people get used to the idea that our government has these advanced anti-gravity technologies, and that our society has to start developing these technologies. And I think it'll probably be used as a prelude to a more full disclosure, something that happens some years down the track when terrestrial life is announced. Because I think one of the main concerns that the government has is that in a post-disclosure world, you need to have governments still having the authority and having the legitimacy in the eyes of the people. The last thing you would want is people around the world looking to extraterrestrial visitors as having the solutions for the planetary problems that we have. So governments want to be able to preempt that legitimacy crisis by coming out now with these advanced technologies to kind of condition people to believe that our government has the technologies and has the ability to come up with solutions to solve planetary problems, so that when ET life is suddenly announced, we're not going to have this legitimacy crisis for the government where people start to lose confidence in the government's ability to solve problems.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Salla, just for some of our listeners who may not be totally up to speed on all this, because I was having a conversation with a very good friend of mine earlier. When we talk about they, as in who they are that are planning all of this and creating kind of this infrastructure, how would you describe to a UFO newbie who these people are that are kind of handling this information, so that some of our listeners might understand this a little better, because you do speak about this well?
Well, some people refer to them as a shadow government. Others refer to them as a control group. Essentially, it's a group of high-level officials that originally were appointed from the national security bureaucracies during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations to make the policy on the ET issue. That has been referred to as Majestic 12. Over time, that name has changed, and we can assume that the Majestic 12 group, or the control group, has evolved to its present structure. But essentially what you have is a large committee or a control group that makes the decisions on when this information is to be released, how to release it, the sequence of steps that need to be followed for full disclosure to happen. And they would plan for many different contingencies and scenarios. And I think that's what we're witnessing now, with the increased media coverage of the Stephenville UFO incident and with the press conference in November 12, that we are seeing the press giving more attention to this. And I get the sense that this is part of a sequence of steps designed to get the public to get ready for disclosures about anti-gravity technologies, these new energy sources, then the beginning of announcements concerning extraterrestrial life, that they'll find kind of fossils on Mars, microbes on other planets and so forth. And we'll kind of go through this sequence where eventually they're going to say that, well, actually, yes, extraterrestrial life, we have made contact.
There you have it, folks. That was how I was reporting the Stephenville UFO sighting of 2008, January, 16 years ago. The show was Dark Matter. I was the host, and that's how it all went down. Several weeks in a row, I covered this along with the national press, and I would like to dedicate today's episode to Angela Joyner and to Jim Mars, both great reporters and journalists who have passed away since then. Angela Joyner eventually passed away on January 7th of 2021, and Jim Mars passed away on August 2nd of 2017. I have great respect for both of them, and this episode is in honor of them. I'd also like to say thank you to Dr. Michael Salla. His work is still out there at the exopolitics.org. You can find that. And ladies and gentlemen, if you like what we're doing here and you like the mind-expanding conversations that we have, please consider liking, thumbs up, subscribing to the podcast. It helps me a lot. I've got a lot more in the pipeline for you coming up this year. I'll be traveling abroad, and we'll be doing probably some shows from overseas. But my name is Michael Parker. I thank you for listening. Until next time, keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.